And also, like, admit everyone. So this is a free event as a precursor to 80 Mann's 5-class series, which will be happening September 15. So just go to thealchemistkitchen.com, take a look at our virtual learning platform. We do have a lot of amazing classes there. If you don't know A.T. Mann, he, like what Lou said, has been an astrologer since 1972 and was an architect in New York and Rome. He has written 16 books, which I happen to have one right here. And when I showed it to him, he said, Ezra, that's not the latest book. You should actually go get the latest one, which is a vision, a new vision of astrology. So I highly recommend that as a reference point for you guys. So that's also a good book to get in preparation for the 5 course series classes. So without further ado, A.T. Mann, Tad. So, oh, and any questions, please post it on the chat and I'll make sure that we raise it with Tad. Oh, you're mute. You're still mute.
I'm still mute?
Yeah, there you go. So I'm going to mute myself.
We've got the phone. So hello, everyone. Welcome to this test class of the 5 events that I'm going to be doing starting on the 15th of September. And thanks to the Alchemist Kitchen virtual education system and so on, that we're going to have a really wonderful time sort of connecting here. So today I'm going to be talking about a whole series of things about how I came to astrology and how this particular idea came about. And then I'm going to show you some images and give you a very brief description of the kind of work we're going to be doing over these 5 events. I think it's quite exciting. In fact, I've been promising a number of people for years to do this. And so now I'm finally having a chance to, and an opportunity to actually do this with the Alchemist Kitchen, which is a real pleasure. So first of all, just to start as a kind of general comment, that those of you who don't know me, those of you who do probably have more information available, but I was originally an architect and I worked in New York City and Rome, and I traveled around quite a lot. I designed a lot of buildings, but then I kind of discovered astrology at one point when I was traveling around in Europe and Morocco and ended up hitchhiking to India. And along the way, I began discovering kind of spirituality of the East in particular, but also Jungian psychology and a whole range of other things, including astrology itself. And so I began looking at it from probably an architect's view, meaning that I was trying to understand how it all worked and how it came together. And I believe, and you will of course see this, that I think I came up with a very interesting synthesis of Eastern ideas and Western ideas with modern psychology, with modern physics, but also with a lot of ancient knowledge that comes from the Renaissance and in fact further back in history and so on. So the idea basically is that I, in the beginning, had a lot of questions about how astrology worked and what the mechanisms behind it was. And I'm going to lead you through that process today. And if anyone has questions, you can actually write them out. And I think Ezra will see them, yes? Okay. So I'm going to actually share the screen. And you will see, here we go. So are all of you seeing this on the screen? It's a page that's called New Vision of Astrology. And so the idea is, as you can see from this image, that I was very much interested, you know, the Leonardo da Vinci diagram that I was very familiar with, which is right in the middle of this. I began realizing, why is that a male figure rather than a female figure? And I decided to do both. So the left-hand half of this figure is female and the right-hand half is male. And one of the basic principles of my way of looking at astrology, which comes not only from the Renaissance, but it comes from the magical Hermes Trismegistus, who was an Egyptian wise person 4 centuries before Christ, who wrote something called the Emerald Tablet. And the gist of it was, the basic principle was, as above, so below. And so this was a wonderful metaphor that was used not only from when it was discovered sometime around the 3rd and 4th century, but also it was a very popular metaphor around the time of the Renaissance, and many people still identify with it. So one of the most interesting aspects of this was that, well, let me see here. Okay. This diagram you can see on the screen here is by Robert Flood, who was a magician in the 16th century. And you can see the diagram. The lower part of the diagram shows a man inside a circle, and it actually says microcosmos, which means, microcosm means the small world or the inner world. And the other expression, macrocosm, means the larger world or the outer world. And you can see there's an inner circle that says microcosm with a man spread across it, implying that somehow this microcosm is in him. But then outside of it is a macrocosm, which is the large world. And what we see as common in both is that there's a sun and a moon and a series of signs of the zodiac and a series of planetary rings in the inner solar system. But we also see that there's a sun and a moon and a series of planetary rings in the outer system. So it's almost as though the solar system around us, including the planets, the sun, the moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, that there's a solar system outside of us, obviously, but the implication was that there's a solar system inside of us. And so I thought this was, absolutely a wonderful metaphor, because they even say things nowadays like the fact that we have the same number of elements in our body as there are in the universe. And then essentially we're composed of stardust. So the metaphor is a kind of an interesting one to look at in that respect. But what's even more interesting is the following dynamic, because I began wondering immediately, what is it that actually connects the microcosm, that inner world, with the macrocosm, which is the outer world? So if you look on the upper right of this diagram, you see this little figure. It used to be called a putti in Renaissance art. First of all, this little creature has goat feet, which identifies him as a creature that's related to Saturn, like a goat. And actually in astrology, Saturn is also a symbol of time. Like the Egyptian god Set actually meant time also, because Set was the god of time in the same way the god Osiris was the god of life and like a sun god. So, but the interesting thing is that he, first of all, is winged, meaning that he's a kind of spiritual being. But also you see on his head up here, there's a little sand clock, which by the way was the most accurate clock available during the 1600s, believe it or not. So the idea then is that this sand clock is surmounted by a little funny cross. And it actually is a symbol of the sign Saturn once again, because Saturn is often indicated as a cross, which means matter, on top of 2 curves. One of them is an upper curve like this, and then a lower curve like this. And so the Saturn symbol symbolizes the idea of matter, which is a cross, on top of 2 moons, which is about emotions. So astrologically, when the planet Saturn is involved, it means that rationality and consciousness in a way is shown on top of feelings and emotions. So the idea here really is that this little creature who signifies time has a spiral cord. You can see it in his hand up here, and I'm going to trace it around the circle on the outside 4 times. And this is indeed quite significant because the idea is that that spiral cord represents what binds the microcosm, the inner world, with the macrocosm, the outer world. And it's quite interesting because when I was at Cornell Architecture School in the 60s, we actually took a course my freshman year in quantum mechanics and relativity. And so I had a kind of working knowledge of how physics and science works. So look at the following metaphor, that if you look at the solar system right here, you actually see that, okay, there we go. The solar system in the Milky Way galaxy is about 2/3 of the way out from the center of the galaxy, which is here. You can see that little spot right here shows where our solar system actually lies. And so the idea is the whole thing is spinning at a phenomenal rate. So our sun actually, you know, we think of it as sitting in space like this with planets revolving around it. Yeah. Well, actually that never happens because the sun is moving around the center of the galaxy 1 million miles every day. And what that means is that the planets trace their arcs around it and they make a series of nested spirals. So the idea was I sat down back in those days, and because I'd also read about a similar metaphor in a book by Rodney Collin called The Theory of Celestial Influence, which is a book that I recommend you look at quite highly. But the idea was that Collin, who is the author of this book, talked about something he called the long body of the solar system, which was the path the planets make around the sun. Okay, so the next diagram is, you see the top of this diagram, actually, your images are in the way on the right-hand side, but it actually should show a kind of solar system off to the right. But you see the sun through time makes a kind of electronic path, which you can see is that middle light straight line, which is the path of the sun over a period of time. And so the planets, as they move around the sun's axis, describe different rhythmic patterns. So the first one out is Mercury. You can see it shown in yellow over here. You know, it's the innermost one. So the pattern of Mercury has a cycle of something like 225 days. And then Venus, the next one out, is shown in green, and it has a cycle of around 1 year and 1/3. And of course, our Earth is shown as a blue spiral, and you see each of these represent a blue spiral around the sun, which is 1 year. So this diagram actually shows 12 years of time. You can see that? So the idea is anyone born at any point during this whole pattern that shows 12 years is really, their horoscope is a slice through the spiraling solar system. So the idea is that I realized back in the 60s, when I came across this information, that the spiraling solar system in time looks a lot like the DNA molecule, which you see in the middle of this diagram. So the DNA molecule is actually, although it looks like it's made of particles, but that was just one representation of it. It actually represents a system that's very similar to the path of the solar system in time. So the idea is it's like every single cell in your body, the DNA, actually acts like a radio receiver that's picking up information from the center of the solar system, but also indeed the galactic center. In fact, the way this thing works is that spirals of different sizes that have a similar pattern by a process that in physics is called resonance. You know, resonance is the thing where you walk into a room and you see someone at the end of the bar or something, you know, and you suddenly realize that you have some kind of communication with them. You know, they may look familiar, they may act familiar, but you resonate. And resonance is also a term that's used in respect to love, or about how our affections are transmitted and so on. So the idea is via resonance, every single cell in your body, which has a little receiver like the DNA molecule, that patterns the path of the planets through time. It means that every cell in your body is receiving signals from the galactic center and from the solar system. So I think astrology is nothing more and nothing less than a communication through resonance between our individual being in time and the movement of the solar system through time and space. In fact, as you'll see in the series of courses that I'm going to be doing, there are many different ways to really look at how astrology works. Like one of them is that each of the planets in the solar system are like endocrine glands. You know, like Venus in the horoscope represents sexual glands and so on. It represents feminine glands, of fertility, women's fertility. The adrenal gland, which is related to Mars, represents anger. The sun represents the thymus gland, which is how we process energy, solar energy in particular. The moon is related to the pancreas, which is the way in which we digest emotions is related to how the pancreas actually works in our body. So the whole idea here is that we have like a miniature solar system within every cell in us that's vibrating with the solar system as a whole, in which we are all traveling. So if you think about it, every human being has traveled along this spiral pattern in time. I've just shown a little segment of 12 years. But if you think about it, the DNA molecule has traveled, and you could track it in your DNA all the way back to the beginning of the first life in the galaxy. So the idea is that instead of having to look above us or to enter some kind of spiritual space, every single human being has access within themselves, within their body, on a spiritual as well as a physical dynamic, access to the whole solar system, and also to all of the past. In fact, that's what DNA is considered to be among scientists, which is it's like a kind of library, universal library of all life and all development. And within the esoteric world, there's a phrase called the Akashic Record, which you might have heard. I recently did a class with the Shift Network about working with our ancestral energies, you know, because we're all here right now. But again, we come from many, many different places, different cultures, you know, different races, you know, different perspectives, different belief systems, and different educational systems, and so on. So we all have a unique history that goes back, and all of them going back a certain distance begin to link. It's almost as though not that we came from one individual person or one couple, you know, an imaginary Adam and Eve, but the whole idea being that we can track our DNA back into time. I actually used one of those systems recently that's called Living DNA, and discovered things that are really very funny in a way, and also very informative, like that I come from a particular Central Asian culture around 6,000 years ago. This is way before Egypt, Chaldea, Greece, Rome, and so on. And I come from Central Asia, where they were sheep and goat farmers, or herdsmen, or herdswomen, that were basically nomadic in some ways because they were wandering with their crop, with their animals. But it bestows a very special gene, which is a gene that allows you to digest milk. So instead of having a reaction to milk, in fact, this gene bestows an ability to eat it, to drink it, to take yogurt, to use all kinds of milk products and cheeses and so on. And it's called a lactose tolerant gene. So the whole idea is that this journey that we've taken through time is a very, very special process. And I suddenly thought to myself that that's really what astrology is. So traditional astrology is kind of curious because, you know, we have a birth chart that has, you know, it's a circle with a series of planets in it that reflect where they were at the time and place when you were born. But the whole idea, which is fascinating about it, is that in a birth chart and even modern astrology, there isn't an essential timing. Like you may have had readings with other astrologies, and you may even be an astrologer yourself. But if you've got Jupiter in the 5th house, for example, how do you know when that actually happened in your life? Is there some inherent way of discovering it? So when I first came across astrology, I was surprised that even though the houses are numbered, that they don't really seem to be seen as a sequence of events. So I began thinking, how can I take this idea of the spiraling solar system and actually apply it to an individual's life? And that was really the birth of what I now call lifetime astrology. So when you look at the DNA molecule in detail, which is this image right here, you basically can see that it looks like a kind of frozen image of a lot of planets, actually planetary movements, but frozen in time. So I'm essentially postulating that this particular way of looking at astrology is about showing how your life and how time affects your process. And also you'll see that there are some unique characteristics of this whole dynamic. Another thing that's interesting, which is really a validation of the core idea about the microcosm is the macrocosm, or another way of putting it, as above, so below. You see this image in the upper left. This is a microscopic electronic microscope photograph of the neurons in a human brain. So you see that pattern of, it's essentially a pattern of coils of energy that connects the neurons in your brain to each other. And do you know what this is in the bottom? It's a cluster of galaxies. Meaning if this is on the micro level, meaning within your brain, that when you go to a maximal level and look at galaxies, like each one of these little spots is like a Milky Way galaxy. That a cluster of galaxies have exactly the same form. So the idea is even on a galactic level, you get this as above, so below connection. And it's called really, in the context of chaos theory, self-similarity between neurons and galaxies. But also another thing that's quite interesting, which I wonder whether any of you have heard about or know about, which is this. This image comes from the Science magazine in the UK. And in fact, it says that the sperm and eggs from your parents carry genetic memories of your parents' health before you were even conceived. Well, this has become the study of epigenetics. And this got me thinking. Around the time that I took up astrology, I had the good fortune to have a child with a friend of mine, in fact. And the idea of having this child was that I began creating this lifetime astrology model at around the time my daughter was conceived. And by the time she was born, it was actually a fully constructed system. And I was actually using it. So the starting point for me came from an idea that Rodney Cullen talked about in the theory of celestial influence, which is that life doesn't start at birth, but rather at conception. So if you think about it, in a funny way, the first event of your life was your mother and father making love to conceive you. And actually, Rodney Cullen talks exactly about this particular metaphor as being incredibly important. And in a way, in astrology, it actually fits as a metaphor because, for example, in astrology, typically the sun in your chart represents your father and the masculine principle in general. It also represents your genetic inheritance from your father's side of your family. And because the sun in astrology represents symbolically your identity, it represents your relationship to the masculine principle, both in terms of men you know, like father, grandfather, husband, brother, boyfriends, and so on, but it also represents the masculine aspect of you if you're a woman. So that masculine dynamic of the sun in the chart represents the outer relationship to the masculine principle that reflects the inner principle. This is also a kind of Renaissance idea, meaning a wonderful astrologer called Marsilio Ficino, that my great friend Georgina Langdale actually has given a little talk about in this similar series, basically is that we have a series of planets outside of us, like Jupiter is about, you know, philosophy and psychology and what we believe and our attitude to religion. In the same way that Venus is about our aesthetics and about what we love and about our sense of judging the appearance of others, as well as being creativity. But you see, we have these principles within us, but we also have planets that symbolize those qualities. So once again, we have a situation where we've got like a series of planets within us that echo and reflect the planets outside of us. And this is really the basis of what epigenetics represents. So I sat down and tried to think, how can I actually bring these dynamics together? And the metaphor that I used was called lifetime astrology. And you can see that on the right-hand side of this diagram. So in astrology, when you look at a chart, see where I'm pointing at the left-hand side at around 9 o'clock on the clock face? It says birth, right? So the idea is that the general principle of astrology, when you look at your own chart, and I hope you have them, because if you take part in this series of 5 programs, you're going to automatically be getting a horoscope created for you, as well as a series of lifetime dates that go back to your conception and ahead automatically to 100 years old. In the beginning, I would do them up into your 70s or 80s, but then people would say, does that mean I'm going to die then? And I said, well, no, it doesn't, because we don't really know that. And that's something that we want to leave as an open question, basically. So I automatically take them up to 100 years old. But the idea is that when you look at your own chart, if you look at this as a kind of model that describes the archetypal dynamic of it, you can see that the archetypal birth moment is called the ascendant. And the ascendant is one of the 12 signs of the zodiac. And it shows sunrise at the time and place and date of your birth. In the same way that the opposite point, which is called the descendant, shows where the sun sets on the right-hand side in the west. This is in the northern hemisphere. So the sun rises in the east and it goes up to the top of the chart, and the cusp of the 10th house is called. You see the houses are numbered: first house, second house, third house, fourth house, fifth house, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, and 10th. You see the numbers are written here. The cusp of the 10th house, which is the beginning of the 10th house, is the equivalent of noon. And in the same way, the cusp of the fourth house is equivalent to midnight. So actually your horoscope is a little chart of the day of your birth, meaning that the ascendant is sunrise, 9 o'clock, well, 6 o'clock in the morning archetypally on the equinoxes. The noon point is the cusp of the 10th house, which is when the sun is brightest. The sunset point around 6 in the evening is the descendant on the right-hand side at 3 o'clock in the clock face. And the IC, which is called the Imam Koli, the bottom of the heavens, is the fourth house cusp, and that occurs at midnight. So even now we can see a couple of basic principles, meaning when you cover the lower half of the chart with your hand, the upper half of the chart is direct and conscious and objective influences, because that's where the sun is. It's at the top of the chart. So the upper half of your chart shows all of the planets that signify consciousness for you, in the same way that when the sun passes the descendant point at 6 in the evening, it goes for 12 hours under the chart, the bottom half, which is darkness, and night, which represents the unconscious, subjective influences, and indirect influences in your life. So the more planets you have above the horizon, the more conscious you're likely to be, the more objective you're likely to be in terms of decision making. But it also indicates that influences tend to be quite direct. Whereas a lot of planets below the horizon means you're more likely to see as a kind of focus or as a creative source the unconscious. And in the same way, it's also quite subjective, meaning you identify with those planets as being a part of you, which is subjectivity. And also, of course, they're indirect influences, because this is the time, as you can see, from childhood. So if birth is here, the first 4 planets represent the time in life from birth until about 7 years old. And this is a time when we grow up within a home and family system, right? I often jokingly say to clients that during childhood, we don't really get to vote about what happens, because we don't have a say in it. We basically are directed by our parents to some extent or another. So in the same way, when we go up in the top or upper part of the chart, you can see that I described a period called gestation. So birth is not the beginning, but rather we go back a third of the whole chart to the cusp of the ninth house, which is right here, you know, at 1 o'clock on the clock face. And that represents the moment of your conception. So the conception point describes the moment and the quality of your parents coming together to make love, to conceive you. It also represents, interestingly, the relationship between feminine sexuality and masculine sexuality in you. It also represents a time when your father's DNA, indicated by the sun, and your mother's DNA, which is indicated by actually a very different form of DNA, which is called mitochondrial DNA, which travels only through the feminine side of your family. So the idea is when your parents make love, it's not only a sperm fertilizing an egg, but it's also your father's DNA interweaving itself with your mother's DNA. If you think about it, it's a very apt metaphor. So I actually included the octave, as I call it, of gestation, of beginning conception on the ninth cusp. And this whole period of time from conception, which is typically, of course, 9 months before birth, all the way over to birth, happens totally within your mother. In fact, the conception happens within her. So I start really at the point when your father and mother make love to conceive you. And during this time from conception to birth, we actually repeat the entire evolutionary process in the womb. Meaning we start as a fertilized ovum, a single cell that's been fertilized by a sperm. You know, the joke is that it somehow takes 1 billion sperms to fertilize one egg. Well, the joke is that they're all men and they refuse to ask directions. So the idea here is that this amazing process that happens at conception is something that actually starts the development of our physical body. So we actually repeat the entire evolutionary process in the womb. And I'm actually going to show you some images from that time, because each of these houses, the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th houses, all symbolizes stages of our evolutionary development that we experience in the womb, that also signifies aspects of who we are. You know, like, it's very interesting to know that from the 7 weeks from when you're conceived until the midheaven, which is when your mother realizes she's pregnant, is about 7 weeks long, okay? And during that time, we go through all of the pre-human evolutionary stages in the womb. So at one point we look fish-like. At one, you know, meaning that we almost have fins and a tail and we're swimming in the amniotic fluid. We also go through stages where we have a kind of reptilian biology, which is called a part of the brain called the R cortex, the reptile cortex. And so the idea is that your brain develops during the first 7 weeks after conception. In fact, when I show you an image of it, which I will somewhere right here, you see this diagram at the bottom? That shows what we look like about at the time your mother realizes that she's pregnant with you. And so the dynamic of it is very interesting, because the 9th house traditionally in astrology represents higher mind. It also represents, interestingly enough, it represents, yeah, this is a larger version of the lifetime wheel. It represents higher mind, because we're developing our brain then, and the planets that occupy the 9th house in your chart tell us about your mental capacity. It also, interestingly enough, it represents long journeys. And this I always thought was intriguing, because if you think about it, first of all, the sperm has to make an incredibly long journey to get to the egg. In fact, this process, you know, I mean, many women clients of mine say, when I made love to produce you, I knew at the moment I had sex. Well, it turns out that's not possible, because it takes at least 36 to 72 hours for a sperm to actually reach the egg in a woman's body. So the whole idea is that life starts with a long journey, and then once the egg is fertilized by sperm, it has to make a journey up the fallopian tube into the uterus, and it attaches itself to the uterine wall and embeds itself, which is the beginning of the cellular body. So the idea is the ninth house, we really don't even have a cellular body yet. And in fact, that's around the time that your mother realizes that she's pregnant. So the midheaven in astrology is almost always called the point of self-realization, as is the ninth house. Meaning in the ninth house, from conception until 7 weeks later, your mother gradually realizes that you're inside of them. So, you know, those of you who have had children know about this process, because at some point, you know, you feel something's different inside. And that's the metaphor of the ninth house in astrology also, because it represents higher mind psychology, philosophy, religion, what you believe. It also governs long journeys, interestingly enough, in the same way that the opposite third house down here in childhood, which is related to Gemini as a sign of the zodiac, represents short journeys. And if Sagittarius in the ninth house represents higher mind, Gemini and the third house during early childhood represents instinctive mind. Okay, so if the ninth house then represents, you know, development of the brain, then anything difficult planets that register here show potential difficulties in terms of concentration, focus, and so on. So then at the midheaven, your mother realizes that she's pregnant. And the midheaven in the chart is seen in the East as being the point at which you take on karma from previous lifetimes. You know, you know the idea about ancestral healing and so on, you know, an ancestral memory. Chinese, a lot of Native Americans, a lot of African cultures all believe in the idea and actually even worship their ancestors. And in fact, I was involved in this ancestral healing summit some months ago, and I said to all of the people who were on my part of the program, I said, by the way, you can see your ancestral healing by looking in a mirror, because it's in you. You know, it's a series of many ancestors that are all right here inside of you at this moment. And if you can figure out how to access them, you can access your ancestry. So then the whole idea is that what I'm doing in my astrology system is I'm actually trying to figure out what happens in each house as a sequence of events in the course of your lifetime. You can see this wheel is divided into 3 segments. One of them is gestation, from conception to birth, right? Which actually is about 10 lunar months long, you know, which is 9 calendar months. Then the second octave, as I call it, begins at birth, when you come out of your mother into an independent existence out in the world. And the first house, Aries, is about bonding with the mother, and planets there and the sign there tells you about the nature of the bond between you as a child and your mother. Like the sign Pisces means that bond is almost like it's a literal bond. It's like a symbiotic relationship. And people with Pisces rising are often drawn. You know what a symbiotic relationship is? It's a relationship where you not only feel connected to someone, but you feel like they're part of you, and vice versa. The sign Aries, which is natural to the first house, means, you know, we immediately start exercising our own personal will. You know, what do you want? What do you desire in the world, and so on. The second house, Taurus, is really about the physical world, and we begin taking solid food around 7 months old. In fact, the childhood time, if gestation represents 9 actual months and 10 lunar months, childhood takes 7 years, which is equivalent to 100 lunar months. And the entire lifetime, all the way up to death, to the end of life, is 1,000 lunar months. So we're actually dividing our life process into 10 lunar months in gestation, 100 lunar months in childhood, and 1,000 lunar months throughout the whole lifetime. So during childhood, we have first house bonding with the mother, which is Aries. You know, the second house, Taurus, is about going on to solid food. You know, we begin crawling and tasting and touching and, you know, realizing, according to the French psychologist Piaget, that we are an object in a world of other objects. And then a Gemini is, which is about communication, is when we start walking and we start talking, we begin developing language. It's also about brothers and sisters. It's the twins. So we recognize our siblings. And then the fourth house is all about parents. It's about family. And in fact, the entire childhood time I see as a stage during which our personality develops, which originates at birth. So your rising sign is your personality, which is how you act and the way people perceive you. But the whole childhood time is an emotional body. So in the same way that gestation is a physical body, that childhood is an emotional body. And we develop a set of emotional patterns based upon how we relate to our mother and father, brothers, sisters, the family system itself, and so on. So do you understand the distinction out there around what would be the difference between a physical body and an emotional body? An emotional body is a higher level of being. It's also more complicated. It's also actually more contradictory, in fact, as we well know, meaning as children, we're expected to figure something out in the world and to develop this personality, which most psychologists agree tends to be more or less complete by the age of 7. As you'll see, this is an ideal wheel, meaning with archetypal ages for these different sign periods. But in your actual horoscope, and I'm going to show you how to do this in the course of these classes, the actual time that it takes to move through each house is different for everyone. The process is the same for everyone. It's approximately similar in terms of the dating of things. But of course, you make developments at different periods of time. And also because you have different signs in each of these houses. So the dynamic of gestation, which is what you inherit, from your mother's point of view in terms of your genetics and in terms of your family history and in terms of your ancestry, during childhood, it's a very different process because we learn by mimicking people around us. We copy our mother and our father and our brothers and sisters. So there's a replication involved, which is actually very Geminian. Geminis tend to replicate language. Cancers tend to replicate emotional behavior. So Cancer people are much more sensitive to the emotional patterns of childhood. Geminis would be more likely to respond to the kind of mental ideas and things like that happen in childhood, or language that's used. A lot of children that are raised bilingual actually remain bilingual throughout their lives. So Taurus is a much more physical because it's an earth sign. It's about a tangible view about personality. And Aries, which is a fire sign, is a very energetic view. So throughout the astrology, we're also utilizing that idea of the 4 elements, which is also very significant, meaning that fire signs like Aries and Leo, which is where we are right now. I have a birthday coming up next week, so I'm a Leo right in the middle of it. And Sagittarius are all fire signs, and they represent people who define themselves by their attitude to energy and the way they work with these things. In the same way that the earth signs like Taurus, down in the lower left, and then Virgo in the 6th house, which is an earth sign, and then Capricorn in the 10th house, which is also an earth sign, where Saturn and Pluto are right now, represents material things. It represents the physical world. It represents matter. And the 3rd house and 3rd sign Gemini is an air sign, which is about communication, ideas, transmission, reflection. And of course, Gemini is one of those signs, as is Libra, about relationship, as is Aquarius. In fact, it's interesting because all 3 of those signs are called double signs also, meaning Gemini is the twins. It's like a brother and sister, but they reflect each other, right? So a Geminian relationship means that you reflect another person. If you have Venus and Gemini, your love relationships are often with people that you attract because you feel that they're similar to you, or a different gender version of yourself, which can also be quite amusing when you start looking at it. So then Libra is very similar. Libra is a double sign because it's about balancing things. Like, in fact, the wheel of Libra is all about the balancing mechanism and about maintaining that sense of balance. Kind of ironically, Librans are often better at balancing other people's relationships rather than their own, but they often also think of themselves as being intrinsically balanced as individuals. So these principles, you'll see, are kind of common descriptors of the way lifetime astrology works, because it means basically that as we move around the chart in the course of our lifetime, we're exposed to all of the 12 signs. And so it's a good idea to understand what they all mean. And you're going to learn that in the course, a brief version of it today, but a longer version of it throughout the whole series of 5 events. And then the last of the 3 air signs is Aquarius, which is interesting because it's 2 water snakes swimming in opposite directions is really the original symbol. It also, some people consider it to be waves of water. But the idea is, I always think about it, because I've known a lot of Aquarians, that it's like the upper wavy line represents an Aquarian's consciousness, and the lower wavy line moving in the opposite direction symbolizes their unconscious. So I always think that whatever an Aquarian tells me, they're actually thinking the exact opposite thing, which is actually a very interesting key when you think about it. So then all 3 of the air signs in astrology are about mind. They're about the types of relationships we form. And then the sign Cancer is a water sign, which is about emotion. Our relationship to our parents is often primarily emotional. It's not really based on logic. It's based on what we feel and what they feel. And so then the next water sign is, of course, Scorpio, which is very mysterious and occupies the end of the life process in a way, when we begin to kind of step away from the world. So the 8th house represents the occult and mysteries and things of that sort. And as well, the 12th house, which is Pisces, which is the last stage of gestation. And of course, it also represents our inner life, our self-sacrificial qualities, and so on. So you can see that as we go through the signs, each sign has a slightly different significance. And I also relate the significance of the signs to the ages at which they register. So the end of childhood is around 7 years old. And of course, that's around the time we go off to school, if we haven't gone already. 7 years old being like the 1st or 2nd grade or something like that in the American school system. So it goes roughly from 7 years old to 12 or 13. And Leo represents education. It represents, a fire sign. It's about playing games. And in a funny way, our civilization or our society is essentially a game that we have to begin figuring out when we start going off to school. It also governs teachers, writing, authors, and ideas like that. It represents coming awake, waking up in a way to our own creativity. So when you have a lot of planets in the 5th house, it often means, A, that time from 7 to 13 is very active. B, that you often meet people, teachers in the beginning, who you either connect with or you don't. But also it's a time when we begin really utilizing our inherent creativity. It might be games, it might be sport, it might be knowledge, it might be reading, it might be our inner life, it might be painting, whatever. Also, it's the time of primary school, and it essentially goes from 7 years old up to 13, which is the age of puberty. So puberty happens around the beginning of the sign Virgo, roughly from 13 to 23 and a half years old. And Virgo is an earth sign, and it's about discrimination. And I don't mean it discrimination in terms of disliking particular things that aren't us, but rather discriminating in a positive way, which means making choices. We begin making choices about our life and what it's going to be like and about and so on. So then, at 23 and a half years old, we begin, first of all, around 7, the maturity octave, which goes from 7 years old to the end of your life. So at around 23 and a half, at the boundary between Virgo and Libra, we basically start, we've probably ended our educational process, Because if Leo is the primary school up to 13, which is around, just a year or so before high school, then Virgo often indicates, higher education, including the last years of high school, but also college or university or whatever kind of schooling you have, and also early work experiences, because Virgo represents work as well, and profession and career. So then seventh house is about marriage, relationships, family, being out in the world from 23 and a half years old to 42 years old, roughly. Then around 42, we begin thinking, like if you've had kids, in your early 20s, for example, which used to be the case and probably isn't so much anymore, that of course is the time when we have a family, we raise our kids and so on. And then around 42, we begin thinking about what we need, about ourselves, about going deeper. I think the eighth house being associated with the sign Scorpio means at around 42, we begin thinking in a different way. We may, get involved in psychotherapy, or we may become interested in healing. We may learn astrology. We might, begin to take things more seriously. So this is almost like a second breath, if you look at it in that way, where people often develop a whole different set of skills. And that takes us up to the end of life, which is also the conception point. So death and conception are really the same place. Colin described it by saying that this is a wheel that begins at conception. It goes around the whole life process through gestation, physical body, childhood, your emotional body, maturity is your mental body. And then you come back again to the same conception point, which is the possibility of creating a higher body, which he called a transcendent or transpersonal body. And the idea basically is that he said that after we're 23 years old, that we begin developing a kind of higher body, a higher perspective of life. And transcendent or transpersonal, they both really mean the same thing. Transpersonal really means going beyond your identity in terms of who you are. That may mean higher things. It may mean more spiritual things. It may mean a more psychological approach. It may mean a more astrological approach. But the whole dynamic of it is basically that we have particular views of things that go beyond the personal. You may know that I've written a number of books, and part of it is that you're almost speaking to a broader range of people than you ever come into contact with personally, which again qualifies as transpersonal. So we all have things that we do that we want to actually, think of as going beyond our own personal, simple bodies and simple lives, as it were. So I really think in a way that the gestation octave represents a function that happens on two different levels, meaning in the same way it represents your parents coming together at conception, your mother gradually realizing that she's pregnant, and at the midheaven often proving it or being tested by a doctor. The 10th house is looking after, material necessities that happen after you realize you're pregnant. The 11th house is very ideological, meaning mothers start thinking about what their children are going to be like. Do you want a male child or a female child? What do you expect from them? What are the expectations and plans, which are all very Aquarian ideas? Or the 12th house is all about self-sacrifice. It's monastic. It's about going inside. It's about meditating. It's about spirituality and things like that. So I really think that gestation functions on two different levels. It's both the deepest level, which is gestation, the creation of our body and so on, but it's also a higher transcendent level. And I made a diagram to illustrate this, except it's moved along somehow. Oh, I know why, because I'm going backwards. Now, why is it doing that? That's so weird. Sorry about this delay. My computer is acting in a very peculiar way. Here it is. So you see this spiraling diagram on the left, the cylinder? Think about that chart instead of being a circle like a chart. if you put it down on the desktop like a paper in front of you, think of that chart as being a cylinder in time, right? So in the beginning, we actually are going to go back to the conception point. And so obviously the lowest level gestation is the physical body. And childhood is the emotional body, which is that middle, that middle quarter of the cylinder. In fact, each layer of the cylinder represents a layer of memories. When we think about our past, the events happen in sequence. And so that sequence really represents layers of memories. And in psychology, you actually start at the surface of the cylinder, which is your present age. And you kind of dig deeper and deeper into your own life and bring up memories of the past. Hello? Someone just checked in. So then childhood is the emotional body, maturity is the mental body, and the transcendent level is a higher level of the events of gestation. So I think about that process and I think, well, it starts with mother and father making love. So the way we create our transcendent body is by combining our spirit and our spiritual life with our soul and our soul life. So spirit and soul coming together creates a higher body, which is like a kind of higher spiritual dynamic in us. And again, the 10th house, which would be, going back again in that whole process of the life process. The 10th house is about material things. So after we discover that we have a higher mind and we begin taking up things like astrology, which I think of as being a kind of transcendent mental process and so on, or a psychological process. The 10th house is we manifest it in some way. We begin doing it, we make it our career maybe, or a profession. The 11th house is about organizations and groups and, and beginning to share that knowledge and beginning to exchange information with other people and so on. And then the 12th house is really kind of seclusion in a way. It's like, originally it's kind of quite monastic. It's like going off to a monastery or beginning to have a much more solitary life or being more meditative. I'm going to be turning 77 years old on, next week on Monday. And I noticed that coming, I'm becoming more reflective, more inward looking, especially with the COVID virus, which is in a way forcing a lot of us to do that. So, but are you beginning to see the pattern of the way this works? So in traditional astrology, you don't really know when the planets register in your life. But in lifetime astrology, you can actually see by knowing where your planets lie around the chart when these influences happen. And that tells us a lot to begin with. If I say to you, you have Saturn registering when you're 17 years old, you might well say, well, oh my goodness, the last year of high school, I had a teacher that really disliked me. And it kind of turned me off to that kind of education. Or a difficult event that manifested in some way. So the idea is that we then look at the chart in a very different perspective. And I read a book about 2 years ago by this author called Bruce Lipton called The Biology of Belief. And I realized, because a client turned me on to the book, but I had done a reading for him some months earlier, and he said, do you know this Bruce Lipton book? And I said, no, I don't. And he said, well, you begin to realize that your astrology system is actually reflecting something that's called epigenetics. And what epigenetics describes, and you can see this at the top of the paragraph, the central dogma of molecular biology is that our genes control our health and our destiny. However, epigenetic science reveals that you are an extension of your environment. Your DNA changes in response to environmental signals, including thoughts, emotions, diet, lifestyle, and your belief system, as far back as when you were in the womb of your mother, and in fact, even further back than that. In fact, Bruce Lipton mentions many situations or many cases where people actually have memories that happen even before they were conceived. Because the sperm and egg that they're being conceived from, of course, have memories that go well back before the conception point. So I think this is a whole other dimension to astrology. The old astrology dynamic of fate or free will, is something quite interesting. But however, it isn't anywhere near as particular and specific as the epigenetic model. And I realize that that's inherent in this lifetime astrology system. So you'll really be learning the earliest influences that happen to you, what they signify, what they could mean, in fact, who could be carrying them. And that's really what we're going to be talking about in the next, for the rest of this little talk, but also, of course, the same kind of dynamic is going to happen when we look at these five programs, when we're going to look at each of these houses in succession. And by that time, if you don't have a horoscope already, you're going to have a horoscope of your own using this particular system that will show you when you enter each house and when you leave that house, what sign occupies it. And also, when did those times happen? So I like the idea of my own system in this way, that because I was able to identify when in one's life these planets registered, that when I talked about what they could signify, it was something you could check on. You could go back and remember who was around when you were 12 or 14 or 16 or 18 or 30 years old. So it's actually very interesting for you if you're beginners in this system, because you can actually work with friends or family members and help them reconstruct their lives by not necessarily being able to tell them what happened, but rather asking them to say, when planets register, what happened when you were 23, when this particular planet registered? So the whole idea is the system is actually very usable. In fact, I sometimes call it dynamic narrative astrology, because first of all, it's always changing, meaning as we go around our own charts, things change. Our perspectives change, our beliefs change. And also at the same time, it's all connected to narrative, which is our story. We always find out more about the stories that lie behind who we are. So, this whole idea of a circular wheel describing a lifetime isn't exactly new, because on the left you see something in Tibetan Buddhism called the Wheel of Samsara, which they think of as the wheel of fate in a way. And if you look around the outside, you can see, it's like stages of lifetime. This is childhood, this may be birth, and there are a whole series of stages of lifetime leading up to being like an old hermit living in the mountains. And so the Wheel of Samsara was seen as being a kind of karmic history of your life. And I quite like that model as an idea. And what I realize, of course, is that lifetime astrology is exactly such a model. So what you're going to be learning in the course of these classes is, A, how to look at your own life as well as the life of people around you. And also there's a kind of interesting parallelism that happens with lifetime astrology, meaning that you get to know people incredibly well. And often they get to know you very well. Because I think as astrologers, and one of my friends, good friends, Andrea, is watching me from wherever she is in Florida, maybe. So the idea is that it actually, and she's used these techniques, that you find out a lot about people because they open up when you start really exploring the story. And not only that, but you also explore yourself. You get to see who you really are and how your ability to make judgments actually functions. This is so funny. It's like normally a right click moves ahead in this particular program, but I'm clicking the right side and it's going backwards. So the idea is that if you look at the timing that I've been talking about, which is around the central inner wheel, basically that wheel is, you see this as a series of dates that go from gestation, which is right here, from conception point in this case, through the birth moment, which is aligned to the ascendant. You see there's a 0 right there. And then childhood in this person's case goes from 0 up until about 5.5 years old as the cusp of the 5th house. And then the cusp of the 6th house is 10 years old. And then the descendant is 25-ish. And then the 8th house in this person's chart is around 55 years old. So at the end of this talk today, I'm going to be giving you a website link. If you actually go to my website, which is atmann.net, and then go to the section on astrology, you will see that there's a little plastic disc. You see, this is a little plastic disc right here, right? So at the end of this session, I'm going to give you a web address. You can go to my website and actually download a handout that I often give away that has a lot of the images you've seen already today. But it also, on the back page, it has an image of this circular wheel. And if you take it to a local, reproduction shop, they basically can make a transparent copy of it on a piece of acetate. And you can then just put it on top of a horoscope and read off when the dates in the horoscope and when the planets in the horoscope register. And this is something we're going to be working with. So if you intend to take the 5 classes, the price for which, by the way, we've decided in the last week or so is going to be $150, which is not very expensive at all for what you're going to be getting. That's 5 hour-and-a-half-long sessions starting on the 15th of September and going into the middle of October. And so the whole idea is that we're going to all start working with this wheel. You're going to have a copy of your own chart. And the idea is that you can follow along with the teaching and actually look at your chart. You can also very easily online find places that will do chart diagrams of your family, your friends, your lovers, and so on. So the whole dynamic is something very, very interesting because it's something you learn by doing it. And you're going to learn by doing these things. So when you actually look at a chart, you see this is a typical birth chart right here. And this is, I call this a kind of a woman, a woman at 17 years old. No, I don't want to do that. I want to get rid of this little box here. Yeah. So this diagram right here, can you see this? This is a young woman's chart, and I've abstracted it a bit in the sense that I've only shown Venus and Jupiter and Saturn down here and Uranus up there. And this is the midheaven, the point when the mother realizes she's pregnant. And this is the way I actually look at a chart. And I'm just going to be giving you an example, a simple one that you can look through and play with a bit. So I'm looking at a chart of someone at the age of 17. And I'm looking at this person's chart, not when they were 17 years old, but much older. So when she was 17, and I knew that she was a woman, obviously, but at 17 years old, she has Venus in the sign Pisces and in the 6th house, which governs higher education. It governs school. It governs also what you do in life as a profession or career. It also represents making your own decisions. It's also just after the time of puberty. So we see a number of things here which are quite interesting. One of them is that Venus represents love. It represents feminine hormones and glands. It represents burgeoning sexuality or affection. It also represents love. And as well, it represents art and creativity. So I combine all of these qualities because Venus in Pisces represents often someone who is quite insular and quite feels separate from the world at this time. But yet she's obviously in love somehow. So Pisces indicates also, as I mentioned earlier, Pisces is about symbiotic relationships, meaning relationships where you feel not only with someone, but also linked to them in some deep, maybe deeply karmic way. So this indicates a time in this young woman's life where, although she's quite isolated going through the Pisces time, that actually some strong emotions are being invoked. So what I do is I go all the way back through the early maturity time, through the childhood time, past the birth moment, all the way back to the midheaven, which was the moment when her mother realized that she was pregnant. So what do you think one of the things would be if a young woman, 17 years old, decides to have a relationship? She's going to have on her mind the fact that, as it turned out, her mother conceived her when she was 17 years old. So she's, one of the things is that she retains her isolation, and that's a quality that comes from that perception. She remembers that her mother was quite young when she conceived her, just because it was a family story. So the fact that she's a little bit isolated, also Pisces represents being in a school with quite a lot of other students, and they're all in art school, which is what Venus represents. 17 is just maybe the last year of high school, and she's just learning to be an artist and being creative. And Venus midheaven means she may at that time even decide that she'd like to make a career of art, because the midheaven shows what is your kind of karmic direction in life. We see there's a trine to Jupiter in Scorpio and in the second house. This is when she discovered the physical world, meaning, between 7 months old and a year and 9 months old is when we begin playing with the physical world. And so I think she probably did a kind of creativity that involved using her hands and making things. She's very creative, very physical in some ways. Also, Jupiter is expansive. It means she meets probably Jupiter at this stage. Jupiter and Saturn represent older models, people that are more mature, who may be teachers or uncles or aunts. So Jupiter actually is a very positive influence on her at that time. And in fact, it indicates probably a teacher at school who actually had a very creative life of her own, and basically was a strong influence on her at that time. There's also a square to Saturn in Sagittarius. And Saturn represents someone older with whom she has almost like a brother-sister relationship. So then you think, that's a bit strange. How does older person connect to brother and sister? Well, it was a teacher at school who befriended her. And I said to her, with Sagittarius, you connected to this person because they were foreign and they spoke a different language. Sagittarius represents foreign influences, someone who's made a long journey to be there. So I think that she had a relationship with a combination of these two people, meaning that she was ready to open up creatively, also sexually or maybe intimately with Venus and Pisces. And also the square to Saturn in the third meant she had a very strong conversation with this individual. But at the same time, the square often indicates a relationship where you can't really enter it. There's like a limit to it. And so I'm trying to put together the pieces that happened at this time as though it was her story. So you see there's a contradiction. The trine is a very flowing aspect and very open, and the square is an aspect that's closed down, that's much more serious, that represents a change in attitude, that something becomes very different and so on. But then the last thing we notice is that from 17, there's an event that goes from 17 years old all the way ahead to Uranus in Taurus that happens in her 50s. And in fact, when we got to her 50s, which was just a few years before I actually did the reading for her, a very interesting thing happened because Venus and Uranus, we're now looking at it not from the Venus point of view, but from the Uranus point of view. Uranus represents individuality. It's about passion. It's about making bold, adventurous moves. Okay, so at 50 years old, ironically, she was an art teacher in a foreign country. And I'm combining all these symbols. She was an art teacher in a foreign country, and she had a secret relationship with a student. So the idea is that the same pattern replicated itself, except that now she was the teacher rather than the student. So can you see what I mean by this kind of process, that we can get some sense of where our life is going and the qualities that we carry by trying to recreate a story that explains to us how and why we function in a certain way? And also that there's a great likelihood that a lot of these patterns are replicated, meaning they very easily can pass on from one time of life into another time of life. And in a way that shows you also its validity, meaning around the time this happened, I was able to advise her about the right way to go about that situation, which is a very unique opportunity. No, so in this time, this Lifetime Astrology also has a number of astrology programs like WinStar Express, a very new program called Astro Gold for Mac, Sirius, which is another astrology program, all have the capacity to make a list of events. When you put in a client's birth information, name, date, place, and time, it'll produce a list of events from the time they were conceived until their old age. So, this is just a slice of one at random. You can see them in general using the time scale disk that I mentioned. But to really be specific about it, you can see that like February 1967, cusp of the seventh house was when I began, the cusp of the seventh house is when you move out of the sixth house above the horizon into consciousness and you begin making conscious choices. This is actually my horoscope right here. And in April 1968, I was working in New York. I got out of Cornell, architecture school after 5 years in 1966. I worked in New York during this period of time and I advanced very quickly. Sextile Moon, sextile Pluto. I designed the police headquarters in 1967. So in 1968, when Uranus happened, it was a time for a sudden change. And the office I worked for invited me to become a partner. And I was walking down Fifth Avenue and I saw the office of the SS France, which was a shipping line. And they had very good prices on fares to Europe, to England. And I walked in and bought a one-way ticket and ended up working in Rome for a year. So the whole idea is that when these events happen in our lives, looking back on it, we can actually look and see what was our rationale behind particular choices. But also it shows us in clients' charts, maybe why it is they did certain things and when certain things are likely to happen in your future. So these are all components of what I'm going to be talking to you about in that series of 5 programs. This is also very interesting because that biological dynamic involved in the process I was talking about in gestation. Joseph Campbell once stated that myth is a manifestation in symbolic images, in metaphorical images of the energies of the organs of the body. This organ wants this, that organ wants that. The brain is one of these organs. So lying beneath even the unconscious, collective or personal is the body and the constancy and urgency of its needs, which are the generators of myth, the guarantors, so to speak, of its identity and authority. And we're going to learn how to translate that into looking at people's horoscopes and their astrology. So the dynamic here is very interesting. And I mentioned this earlier, that one of the interpretations of the planets, meaning the planets in the chart in your life show, first of all, a cast of characters, meaning the sun is your father, but then it's also your attitude to men in general. And the moon starts out being your mother, but then eventually it becomes your relationship to women, and it may be the mother in you, and so on and so on. So the planets are the cast of characters and also reflecting the subpersonalities within us. Also the endocrine glands and the bodily systems on the physical level. So you can see in this diagram, the thymus governs the heart, and then it spirals out to the pancreas, which is the stomach, and then Venus, which represents the parathyroid gland, and then the thyroid gland is indicated by Mercury, which is about pulmonary respiration, and then the adrenal gland is related to Mars, about fight and flight and anger and things like that. And then Jupiter and Saturn are a pair. Jupiter represents the posterior node of the pituitary gland, and Saturn is the anterior node. And then we go all the way around to Uranus being the genitals, and Neptune represents the pineal gland, the spiritual gland in the center of the brain. So all of these things are basically aspects of that planetary. There's a book by Eberton called The Combination of Stellar Influences, and he looks at every combination, every aspect between one planet and another. Like Saturn and Uranus is irritability and tension, because Uranus is wanting to move and Saturn is being stuck or being trapped. So it has biological correspondences. It means unrhythmical processes, difficulty breathing. It's like also it tends to violent people, to growths of strength caused by overcoming difficulties, and so on. So there are all kinds of tools we're going to be using to actually interpret these planetary influences. And again, I call this the wheel of therapies because, you know, it's a very handy way that I actually created many, many, many years ago to look at how the aspects function in terms of how deeply they go into our center. So there's like a sextile aspect out here is very peripheral. Sextiles in the chart show connections between planets in your chart that are at the edge of your being. They're like, you know, mental understanding. An emotional connection with someone is indicated by a trine. You can see it goes almost exactly halfway into the center and no deeper. So a trine shows situations where you're in relationship with someone where you allow them only halfway into your middle, your core, and they only allow you halfway into their core. So it's a relationship that has a certain amount of depth, but it doesn't open up to the center completely. Whereas like a square goes into the middle and forces you to change direction to get back out to the periphery. And of course, in opposition, steamrolls right through the middle. And that shows situations where the oppositions in you, the contradictions in your nature really start to show up. So the idea is that the aspects show the relationship of the planets themselves show the cast of characters in your life, and the whole chart and its timing shows the generation of your life process. This is called a strange attraction. This is actually a symbol in chaos theory about how planets connect to each other, which is that they have mutual pulls. They have like an energy between them, and every pair are different. And we're going to describe all of those in the course of the 5 classes. You know, I've analyzed in a number of my books, the book that Ezra mentioned, Life Time Astrology, is actually an analysis of John Lennon's horoscope. And you can see on the right that I can just take all of the aspects out of the middle and look at when the planets in his chart registered. Like the moon is in gestation, and moon in Aquarius means your mother was very abstract and detached about realizing that she actually had you. And I don't know if you know John's lyrics at all, but one of his amazing songs was called Mother. And he sang in this song, Mother, you didn't want me, but I never had you. So the whole idea being that his mother was really present, never present to him in his lifetime. And in fact, I met someone recently who's actually studied the music of John Lennon, and he agreed with me that basically every planet in his chart represented events that occurred literally in his life, including Mars in the 6th house, meaning the time that he met Paul McCartney. Neptune was when he began making music, you know, with other musicians. Venus happening at around 9 years old is when he started playing the guitar and invented his own language. Pluto was when Pluto moon opposition was when his mother, you know, really distanced herself from him. You know, just after he was born, his grandmother and grandfather raised him, and they were essentially parental figures. So you can see from a person's horoscope at just a glance certain primary things about who they are. This is kind of an interesting one I'm going to look at very briefly because we're getting towards the end of our time, as Ezra will probably remind me.
Yep.
Just another minute or two, a few more minutes. So you see all of the planets around the conception point, which is the 9th cusp, right? Like Venus is just before it, as well as the moon. See, moon and Neptune together in Scorpio means the mother of this person was very sensitive and very naive. And so moon Neptune indicates incredible sensitivity. It's like being in a relationship where she kind of gives herself to another person. It's a very Piscean relationship in a way. And look at Venus in Sagittarius. It's like she, you know, sexuality is something that occurs before maybe the first time that she made love. And in fact, when I did the reading, I suggested that this could have been her first lovemaking experience, and it was. So actually, it's very much like the dynamic. I called it a virgin conception because she didn't even realize that she was pregnant. And so the dynamic of it is that this is a very powerful dynamic in this person's chart. In fact, he's got actually Sun, Mars, and Mercury in the 9th house. Mercury means a journalist of some kind. The Sun means that he has a certain amount of notoriety. Mars represents war or battles or armies and so on. It turns out that he's one of the best known photographic journalists of wartime places in the world, and has been for the last 25 years. So the dynamics that came up very early on in his gestation, meaning his mother wondering what had happened and suddenly realizing that she'd created a child, and it took her a while to actually accept that fact, was translated into the fact that these three qualities represent a look at his higher career. So then we look at this model of, of the physical body, the emotional body, the mental body, and the spiritual body. And look, if you took the planets and you folded this over and they were transparent, you'd see that the planets are actually moving up the middle of the spiral. And the spiral really represents almost like a funnel or a cylinder of the whole life process. And that the whole idea is that we move through that entire cylinder through the course of our life. And the cylinder fills up with layers of memories that show, our developmental stages in life. Again, I'm not going to show any more charts because they could get very complicated, like this one. This was a situation where there was an abortion attempt that happened over here about 2/3 of the way through gestation, which is very dangerous. And obviously it wasn't successful because the woman who experienced it in her chart came to see me when she was over in her, in her early 30s. And it had difficulties with men and a lot of other issues that came from that, that moon node in Scorpio combination directly opposite to Saturn, indicates a tremendous resistance to being creative and so on. So all of these charts that we're going to be looking at are actually examples of particular ways of being. And in fact, everyone who signs up for the course is going to be asked whether they're open to having their chart looked at. Not that I'm going to guarantee that I'm going to look at everyone's chart, because I don't know how many people are going to sign up for the series. But the whole idea is if you might be interested in participating in the series, and give us the okay, and that means either Esa or Rashina at the Alchemist Kitchen, that will provide a horoscope for everyone and a list of dates, but we may actually look at a number of charts and to really see what people's life functions are really about. This is Winston Churchill. Again, I'll probably show a longer version of his at some point, but it indicated that Pluto on the conception moment is a very fated person. And of course, Churchill, all the way around the chart, it's funny because this happened just before he was born, and it indicates almost like a forced conception, which was opposite Mercury and so on, and in a funny relationship to Venus. But so the whole dynamic is that something unusual happened at his conception, but it also went all the way around the chart to register just at the end of his life when he was in his late 60s. He became Prime Minister of England during the Second World War and is considered one of the great English heroes. So you can see a person's entire life process in the wheel. And I think you'll like actually playing with this whole technique and the system. Again, I'm just going to skip through some of these. Towards the end, this is about families that, each child in the family comes into being at a different stage of the parents' relationship, because you can see the parents' relationship between the sun and the moon. And it's a very interesting dynamic to really know, what your parents' relationship was like around the time they had you and what impact you had on their life. So various children in the family have the same parents, obviously, but they also have very different relationships between them, which show how their differences function. And again, this just shows that body of that spiral of the four bodies looks very much like the chakras. It looks very much like a theosophical way of looking at a life process. You see, this also shows the chakras show up in the body very much like that cylindrical image. So, there are also a lot of predictions that can happen, and these various other techniques actually function to illustrate this. And as well, there's an element of reincarnation involved in this entire process, which I will certainly hit on, but not really make a major event out of, although it might be another series to follow this up. So I wanted to show this quick little 1 minute.
We keep visualizing, and we teach this in schools to all the children, that the solar system has the sun in the middle and planets going in circles around it like this. And I mean, in my school, we even had a little device where you had the sun in the middle and you could turn the little thing on the bottom, and the planets would go around. And is this true? No, absolutely not. In fact, thinking of the solar system this way is equivalent to thinking the Earth is flat. The sun is moving at thousands of miles per second through space, and our planets are following, producing a huge elliptical coil in space. And year after year, we do not trace the same circle in space. We're actually thousands and thousands and millions of miles from where we were the year before. So to think of our solar system as some flat structure that's stationary is again the result of isolating a system and trying to analyze it. And typically when you do so, you get the wrong data. As soon as you open the system and you realize the solar system is inside the galaxy and moving through space, then you realize that actually we're making a pilgrimage, literally, through space as we evolve. And you could even think of it in the concept of a vacuum structure, that we are embedding all of our evolution on the structure of the vacuum as we move through that great spiral we're producing through space. Every single individual on our planet producing that very specific spiral in space, and we could follow it back for any individual all the way back to when they were in the womb of their mother, which connects their spiral with their mother's spiral, and then follow that back and again and again and again. And that is the continuity of the information inside the gene structure of our evolution through space. And now we get a much more complete view of the structure of the mechanics of our evolution.
So I wanted to show that because this is a cutting-edge physicist who came up with a very similar model not so many years ago, and that in a way I saw it as a kind of validation of this viewpoint that I came up with 50 years ago. So anyway, that's really the gist of what we're going to be dealing with in the 5 programs. And also, the book that Eza mentioned before, A New Vision of Astrology, she's going to find a way to work with Simon & Schuster, who were the publishers of this book, to figure out a way of getting you copies. Because it's not an expensive book, it's only $14 or something, but the whole dynamic of it is expressed in this book, as well as a lot of tables that would be very useful in terms of interpretation. And also, again, I mean, this is where you can contact me if you want, which is at atmann.net, which is my website. And also, of course, this is the contact of the Alchemist Kitchen. If you need information, if you would like to book into the series of 5 programs, email Regina at thealchemistkitchen.com, or you can contact Eza also at the Alchemist Kitchen, and they will give you information about how to pay, about how to join the class, and basically the whole rules of the process. So anyway, thank you all for being here today. I'm sorry it ran over a little bit, a few minutes, but that kind of happens sometimes.
It happens. So thank you so much, Ted. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining this free class. And we hope to see you soon for the next series of classes and, diving deep into Lifetime Astrology. So we'll send out a link to the series as part of the recap, as well as the recording for this class.
Right, and also I'm going to be sending along with that, because I'm going to send this to Eza, is that fold out that I mentioned to you that has the picture of that transparent wheel on the back.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Just just so that you can figure out a way of having one of your own and make a copy of them, a few of them.
Yeah.
Also this, I don't know whether there's a date by which they have to register for the whole series, Ezra?
The day before the actual start of the class.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. So thanks everyone for coming today. And I really appreciate that you were here. I made it with 1 minute to spare, I have to admit, which is pretty crazy, but still it didn't affect it at all. So
it was very beautiful. I have so many notes. I'm like, I have questions. I can't wait for the next class then.
Yeah,
you guys,
and also the classes are going to be a lot more open-ended because we have a lot more time. And I had a lot of material to go through today, but realize that I'll be here for your questions during the classes. And also you're going to be looking at your own charts, because I'm actually going to personally do every one of them, because when you sign up, you're going to be giving Rosina, your birth information so that I have the right chart for you. So anyway, thanks everyone for coming, and I appreciate it tremendously. And I look forward to showing you my work and more of it.
Mind blown, just mind blown.
So thank you, Ezra.
Thanks, Tad. We'll be in touch. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And
Bye, Andrea.
we couldn't answer all of the
Thank
questions,
you.
but hopefully we can once if people sign up for the course. So there you go. And
Okay.
Georgina is on as well.
Hmm?
Georgina is on as well, Tad.
She is. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I'm kind of scrolling through.
Yes, thank you. That was great.
You're welcome.
It's amazing.
Lauren.
Lauren. Yeah, I don't see Georgina, but if she's there, I'll take it on.
Yep.
Anyway, bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.